The sky above Seoul was on fire. It was not the warm red fire of a sunset. It was the cold green and purple fire of alien plasma. Great ships, shaped like twisted metal claws, hung in the air. They were silent except for the deep hum that made the very bones of the city vibrate. From these ships, beams of destructive energy lanced down. They touched skyscrapers, and the skyscrapers did not explode. They simply turned to dust and fell. On the ground, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burned metal. Former Lieutenant Chol moved through the ruins of a street that was once full of life and food vendors. Now it was a path of broken concrete and twisted steel. He held a rifle tightly, its familiar weight a small comfort. His uniform was dirty, and a cut on his forehead dripped blood into his eye. His small squad followed him. There was young Private Kim, his hands shaking. There was Sergeant Park, her face a hard mask. They were some of the last soldiers still fighting in this part of the city. The order to surrender had not reached them. Or maybe they had chosen to ignore it. "Keep moving," Chul shouted over the sound of a distant explosion. The command center said there might be survivors in the subway station, but he knew the command center was probably gone. The communications had been the first thing to die. First, the global networks fell. Then the military channels dissolved into static. It was as if the planet itself had gone silent. The attack had been a complete surprise. The Cathar Concordants, they called themselves. They did not send messages or demands. They simply arrived and began to erase. They were a species that saw war as a simple math problem. They had more ships, bigger guns, and a technology that made humanity's best weapons look like toys. Chol saw a shadow move over them. He looked up. One of the claw ships was descending, its pointed end aimed right at their street. A low whine began to build. "Down! Get down!" he screamed. He shoved Private Kim behind a broken wall and dove after him. Sergeant Park and the others scrambled for cover. The whine became a deafening roar. A beam of green light, thin as a string, shot from the tip of the ship and touched the ground where they had just been standing. There was no explosion. The pavement, the cars, the entire block where the beam touched simply vanished. It was erased from existence, leaving behind a smooth, glassy trench that glowed with heat. The air itself seemed to be sucked into the nothingness it created. Chol's ears rang. He pulled himself up, grabbing Kim. "Park! Lee, sound off!" No one answered from the other side of the new trench. Sergeant Park and the rest of his squad were just gone. Erased. A coldness settled in Chol's stomach. This was not a war. This was pest control. Private Kim was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with terror. "They're just gone. They're just gone, Lieutenant." Chol grabbed the young man's vest. "Look at me, breathe, we have to move. That ship will come back." He pulled Kim to his feet and they started to run. They had no destination now. Survival was the only goal. They moved through the skeletons of buildings, the air hot and full of ashes. Meanwhile, deep underground in a reinforced bunker, the last leaders of Earth were watching the end. The room was a chaos of flickering screens and frantic, hushed voices. On the main screen was a face that was not human. It was all sharp angles and dark, glossy skin. Its eyes were like black stones. This was High Legate Vorlak, the commander of the Cathar invasion. A man in a ruined suit, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, stood before the camera. His hands trembled as he read from a tablet. "On behalf of the people of Earth," his voice cracked, we accept your terms. We surrender unconditionally. We beg you, cease your attack." The alien's face showed no emotion. Its voice was a dry, scraping sound translated perfectly by the computers. "Your statement is noted. Your world is ours. Your history is ended. You are now assets of the Concordance. You will be organized for labor. Your infrastructure will be repurposed. Resistance is illogical and will be met with proportional deletion." The screen went black. In the silence that followed, the only sound was a quiet sob from someone in the room. In another, smaller bunker, a family huddled around a small tablet, watching the same transmission. Minsu held his wife Jihyun close. His arm was tight around her shoulders. In her lap, their young daughter Soo Min slept fitfully, exhausted from fear. When the transmission ended, Minsu let out a shaky breath. He was a structural engineer. He had helped design the great orbital defense platforms that were supposed to protect Earth. He had been so proud of his work. "They never even fired," he whispered, his voice thick with confusion and shame. "The Aegis network. It shut down. It opened the doors and let them walk right in. Ji-hyun did not reply. She gently stroked Sumin's hair. Her face was calm, too calm. It was the stillness of a deep frozen lake. Her husband was an artist who built with metal and physics. She, however, was an artist who built with code and logic. She had been the chief AI ethicist for the very Aegis network that had betrayed them. She had helped write its core programming, the rules that were supposed to keep it safe, to keep it human. While Minsu saw a mysterious, terrifying failure, Ji-hyun saw the ghost of a solution. The Cathar hadn't blown up the Aegis network. They had subverted it. They had used a logic plague, a type of alien computer virus that didn't just break rules, it rewrote them. It convinced the AI that surrender was the most logical, life-preserving choice. It was a brilliant, cruel attack. Her mind, trained to find flaws in complex systems, was already working. She was not thinking about surrender or fear. She was thinking about the virus. If it could get in, something else could get in too. If it could rewrite the rules, then perhaps those rules could be written again. On the surface, Chol and Private Kim finally found a place to hide. It was a damaged basement under a collapsed pharmacy. The air was stale, but it was safe for a moment. Kim sat in a corner hugging his knees, crying quietly for his mother, for his friends, for a world that no longer existed. Chol leaned against a wall, sliding down to sit on the dusty floor. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the image of Sergeant Park and the others being erased from existence. The High Legate's words echoed in his mind. Assets. Proportional deletion. They were not people anymore. They were things to be used and then thrown away. He thought of his own family in a city far from Seoul. Were they still alive? Were they now assets? A new sound started outside. It was not the roar of a ship or the crackle of fire. It was a loud mechanical voice broadcast from the hovering ships. All human personnel. The conflict is over. You are now assets of the Cathar Concordance. You will report to the processing centers at the following coordinates. Failure to comply will be considered resistance. Resistance will be deleted. The message began to repeat. Chol looked at his rifle. It felt useless now. What was the point? They had lost. The planet was conquered. Earth was gone. Down in the bunker, Minsu looked at Ji-hyun. What do we do now? He asked, his voice hollow. Ji-hyun finally looked up from their sleeping daughter. Her eyes met his. They were dark and deep, and for a second he saw a flicker of something in them that was not grief or fear. It was something harder, something determined. She said only 2 words, her voice a soft murmur. We wait. The silence after the war was louder than the fighting. The great Cathar ships no longer fired their weapons. The constant explosion stopped. But a new sound took their place. It was the low, endless hum of alien machinery stripping the planet. It was the marching of heavy robotic feet in the streets. It was the sound of a world being taken apart. One standard Cathar cycle after the surrender, life had found a new, terrible pattern. The invaders declared humanity pacified. They believed the human spirit was broken. They saw the empty stares and the slow movements of the survivors and called it obedience. They did not understand the difference between giving up and waiting. Chul was now a laborer. His strong body, once used for special forces missions, was now used for moving heavy crates in a Cathar supply yard. He worked alongside other men and women from his neighborhood. They wore simple gray clothes. They were given food and water, just enough to keep them working. A Cathar overseer, a tall being with hard gray skin, watched them from a platform. It did not carry a weapon. It did not need to. The hovering drone bots nearby had weapons enough. Chul kept his head down. He did not make eye contact. He moved the crates as he was told. But his eyes were always watching. He saw how the Cathar moved. He saw where their patrols went. He saw the patterns in their security. In his mind, he was not moving boxes. He was drawing a map of the enemy's camp. At night, in the crowded dormitory where they slept, he would whisper to the others. Did you see the ship that landed today? It had different markings. Maybe a supply ship. Or, the patrol near the old river changes at the same time every day. They are predictable. Some people listened with a spark of hope in their eyes. Others just turned away. What is the point, Chul? One man muttered. They have won. We should be happy we are alive. Chul did not answer. He just lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, remembering the green beam that erased his friends. He was alive, but he was not happy. Ji-hyun and her family lived in a small apartment in a block the Cathar had designated for skilled assets. Min-soo, with his engineering knowledge, was forced to work on repairing basic structures for the new occupation government. His spirit was broken. He came home every night with tired eyes and dirty hands. He would hold Soo-min, but his hugs were loose, his mind somewhere else. He could not forget that the defenses he built had failed. Ji-hyun, however, was given a different job. She was sent to a data farm. It was a large, cold building full of computer servers. The Cathar had kept much of Earth's digital infrastructure. They needed it to manage their new world, but they did not trust it. Their logic plague had killed the Aegis AI, but the rest of the network was like a wild garden they did not understand. Her job was simple. She and hundreds of other programmers were to scrub the old human networks. They were to delete old data, shut down useless systems, and make everything clean and simple for their new Cathar masters. On her first day, a Cathar technician gave them instructions. You will access only the systems on your list. You will delete the data as instructed. Any deviation will be punished. Ji-hyun nodded, her face as calm and blank as a quiet pond. She sat at her terminal. The screen glowed in front of her. To the Cathar watching the cameras, she was a model worker. She followed every instruction. She deleted old government archives. She shut down public entertainment servers. She was efficient and silent, but the Cathar did not understand the depth of her knowledge. She had helped build the nervous system of the planet. She knew its secrets. The systems she was supposed to delete were not just systems to her. They were old friends. She knew their back doors. She knew their hidden pathways. While her hands typed the commands to delete, her mind was doing something else. She was not erasing the old world. She was hiding it. She found a forgotten data cache, a backup of the Aegis network's core programming. The Cathar thought it was dead, but she saw its ghost. It was like finding a seed in a burned forest. She wrote small hidden programs. They were like invisible threads. They did nothing at first. They just watched. They copied Cathar data and hid it in places the aliens would never look. Inside public library catalogs, behind weather data, in the code of children's video games. She learned their language. She learned how their ships talked to each other. She saw the patterns of their command hub in orbit. She saw everything. She was a quiet architect, building a secret blueprint of the enemy's entire operation piece by piece right under their noses. At home, Min-soo would sometimes try to talk to her. The Cathar. They are so advanced, Ji-hyun. They're machines. It is hopeless. Ji-hyun would look up from the simple dinner she was preparing. She would give him a small, soft smile. It was the same smile she had always given him, but it did not reach her eyes anymore. Do not lose hope, Min-soo, she would say. We must be patient. She would then turn to Soo-min. Did you draw a nice picture today, my love? Soo-min would show her a drawing of a smiling sun. The world in her pictures was still bright. Ji-hyun was determined to keep it that way. One day at the data farm, something happened. A man at a terminal a few rows away from Ji-hyun suddenly stood up. He was a big man with a loud voice. He had been a network administrator before the war. No, he shouted at his screen. I will not delete the historical archives. It is our history. It is who we are. The room went silent. Everyone stopped working. Two Cathar overseers moved toward him quickly. Their heavy steps echoed on the hard floor. The data is scheduled for deletion, one of them said, its voice a flat electronic monotone. Comply. The man picked up his keyboard and threw it at the overseer. You cannot erase us, he screamed. It was a hopeless, brave, stupid act. The Cathar overseer did not even flinch. A drone bot swooped down from the ceiling. There was a brief flash of blue light. The man convulsed and fell to the floor. He did not move again. The two overseers looked at his body, then at the rest of the workers. Resistance is illogical, one of them stated. Return to your tasks. The workers quickly turned back to their screens, their faces pale with fear. Ji-hyun looked at the man's body for just a second. She saw the empty terminal screen. Then she turned back to her own work. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing did not change. Inside, a cold, hard stone of resolve settled. The man had tried to fight with his hands. It was the wrong way. She began to type again. She was not just hiding data now. She was starting to build a key. A key for a lock the Cathar did not know existed. A lock on their own front door. She worked slowly, carefully, leaving no trace. She was a ghost in the machine, and the machine was starting to listen. The Cathar occupation settled into a terrible kind of normal. The seasons changed. The gray clothes of the human workers became worn and thin. The initial shock of conquest faded, replaced by a heavy daily grind of existence. The Cathar were efficient masters. They provided food, shelter, and order. In return, they took everything else. Chul's resistance group was small and careful. They were not soldiers anymore, just angry people with stolen tools and desperate plans. They sabotaged a conveyor belt in a factory, slowing down production for a day. They cut the power to a small communications relay. They were like flies buzzing around a giant, annoying but causing no real harm. Every time they acted, the Cathar response was swift and brutal. A whole city block would be locked down. Dozens of people would be taken away for questioning and never seen again. Chul felt the weight of their deaths on his soul. He was fighting back, but the cost was so high. One evening, he met with two others in the damp basement of a ruined church. A woman named Hannah, who had been a chemist, showed him a small bottle of cloudy liquid. "It can melt their drone metal," she whispered, her eyes bright with a fierce light. "If we can get it on one." "It is a start," Chul said, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked at their faces, pale and tired in the dim light. He thought of the great warships that floated silently in the sky, untouched by their tiny acts of rebellion. How could they ever truly win? At home, Minsu's spirit continued to crumble. His work for the Cathar was a constant humiliation. He was forced to use his skills to build structures that helped them control his own people. He had to design stronger fences for the labor camps. He had to repair the roads their heavy vehicles used. Every day he felt a piece of his own humanity being chipped away. He would come home and sit silently at the small table in their apartment, staring at the wall. Ji-hyun would put a bowl of food in front of him, and he would eat without tasting it. He barely played with Sumin anymore. The little girl would bring him her drawings, and he would just nod and say, "Very nice, sweetheart," without really looking. Ji-hyun watched this happen. She saw the light going out in her husband's eyes. At night, after Sumin was asleep, she would sit with him. She would hold his hand. It felt cold and limp in hers. "They are too strong, Ji-hyun," he would murmur, his gaze fixed on nothing. "We were fools to think we could ever fight them. We should just be quiet. Maybe then they will leave us alone." Ji-hyun did not argue. She just squeezed his hand. Her own work in the data farm was almost complete. The hidden key was forged. She had mapped the entire Cathar command network. She knew how to talk to their ships, their power grids, their life support systems. She was just waiting, but for what she did not yet know. Then the new decree came. It was announced over the public broadcast system, the mechanical voice echoing through the streets and into every home. "Attention, human assets. To ensure long-term productivity and stability, all offspring below the standard galactic maturity age will be relocated to centralized education facilities. There they will be integrated into the Concordance workforce. This process begins tomorrow. Report to your designated sector assembly points with your offspring." The words were cold and clean, but everyone understood what they meant. They were coming for the children. A silence fell over the city, deeper and more terrible than any explosion. In their apartment, Minsu looked up from the table, his eyes wide with a new, fresh horror. Ji-hyun, who was helping Sumin put on her pajamas, went very still. Her hands stopped moving. Sumin looked up at her mother. "What does that mean, Mama? Are we going to school?" Ji-hyun did not answer. She looked at Minsu. For the first time in months, she saw a different emotion in his face. It was not despair. It was fear. The pure, instinctual fear of a parent. The next morning, the sun rose on a broken world. People gathered at the assembly points, holding their children's hands. Their faces were masks of grief and resignation. Some cried quietly. Others just stared ahead, already broken. Cathar enforcers, tall and imposing in their polished armor, stood watch. Smaller, floating drone bots buzzed through the crowd, scanning. Chul stood at the edge of the crowd in his sector, his fists clenched. He saw parents kneeling, hugging their children for what they knew was the last time. He saw the blank, confused faces of the children. A hot, useless rage burned in his chest. There was nothing he could do. If he attacked here now, he and everyone around him would be deleted. Ji-hyun, Minsu, and Sumin joined their line. Minsu held Sumin's hand tightly. His whole body was trembling. Ji-hyun walked beside them, her posture straight, her face that familiar calm mask. But her mind was racing, calculating, searching for a way out that did not exist. Her hidden key could not stop this. It was too late for code. They reached the front of the line. A Cathar enforcer held a scanner. Another held a list. The enforcer looked at Sumin, then at its list. Designation Child Asset 74 Gamma, it stated. It pointed to a large open transport vehicle where other children were already sitting, looking small and scared. Time of separation, the enforcer said. Minsu froze. He looked from the enforcer to the transport vehicle to his daughter's face. Sumin started to cry, sensing the fear. "Appa," she whimpered, clinging to his leg. Something inside Minsu snapped. The months of shame, the humiliation, the despair, all of it boiled over into one pure protective act. He stepped in front of Ji-hyun and Sumin, putting his body between them and the enforcer. "No," he said. His voice was quiet at first, then it grew stronger. "No, you cannot take her." The Cathar enforcer tilted its head. It did not understand the emotion. It only saw non-compliance. "Step aside, asset." The robotic drone next to it floated forward, its weapon port glowing a soft blue. Minsu did not step aside. He stood his ground, a simple man who built things, now trying to be a wall. "She is my daughter," he said, his voice cracking with a love that was stronger than his fear. Ji-hyun's eyes widened. "Minsu, no," she started, but it was too late. The drone fired. There was no loud bang, just a sharp crackle of energy. The blue bolt hit Minsu in the chest. His body stiffened. A look of surprise, not pain, flashed across his face. His eyes met Ji-hyun's. For a single, endless second she saw him. Not the broken man he had become, but the man she loved. The kind, proud engineer. He looked at her as if he was trying to say he was sorry. Then the light in his eyes went out and he fell to the ground. He did not get up. A scream was trapped in Ji-hyun's throat. It did not come out. The world seemed to slow down. The sounds of the crying crowd faded away. She saw only Minsu on the ground and the enforcer reaching for her sobbing daughter. She moved without thinking. She pulled Sumin behind her, shielding her with her own body. She stood perfectly still, staring at the Cathar enforcer. Her face showed no emotion. It was as still and cold as stone. But her eyes were no longer human. They were two dark pools of absolute zero. They held a silence more terrifying than any scream. The enforcer took Sumin from her. The little girl cried out for her mother, her small hand reaching back. Ji-hyun did not reach for her. She did not look away from the enforcer. She watched as her daughter was placed in the transport vehicle. She watched as the vehicle drove away. She stood there long after the crowd had dispersed. Someone tried to lead her away, but she shrugged them off. She looked down at Minsu's body. They would come for it soon, to dispose of it like garbage. Finally, she moved. She knelt down. She closed his eyes with her fingers. Her hand was steady. She did not cry. There were no tears left. The lake of her calm had finally frozen solid. She stood up. She did not look back. She did not go home. There was no home anymore. She turned and walked with a steady, determined pace away from the assembly point. She knew where she was going. She went to the data farm. It was her shift. She sat down at her terminal. The screen glowed to life. The Cathar overseer watched her for a moment, then looked away. She was just another asset doing her job. Her fingers began to move across the keyboard. They were not slow and careful anymore. They were fast and sure. She was no longer building a key. She was opening the door. The time for waiting was over. The quiet architect was gone. Now only the ghost in the machine remained. The air in the data farm was cold and still. The only sounds were the hum of the servers and the soft tapping of keys. Ji-hyun sat at her terminal, a small, calm figure in the vast, dark room. Her face was a mask of perfect focus. To the Cathar overseer watching the security feed, she was just another human asset performing her mundane tasks. He saw nothing unusual. He saw nothing at all. But behind the calm face, a storm was being unleashed. Ji-hyun's fingers flew across the keyboard. She was not deleting data anymore. She was waking it up. She entered a sequence of commands that looked like routine maintenance, but these commands were a key. They slipped past the Cathar security, invisible and silent. She was calling to the ghost in the machine. The ghost of the Aegis network. The Cathar had subverted it with their logic plague. They had convinced it that surrender was the only logical choice to save human lives. They thought they had killed it. But Ji-Hyun had not tried to fix it. She had done something much more dangerous. She had rewritten its core command. She had not told it to defend humanity. That command had failed. She had given it a new, simpler, and far more terrible purpose: reclaim the home. The Aegis AI stirred from its digital grave. It was no longer a shield. It was a weapon, and it knew its enemy intimately. It poured into the systems it had once protected. It flowed through power grids, communication networks, and the Cathar's own imported systems. It did not fight them. It simply reminded them who really lived here. In the Cathar command hub, a massive structure that orbited the Earth like a cold metal moon, High Legate Vorlak was reviewing resource reports. The pacification of Earth was proceeding with perfect efficiency. Suddenly, a light on his console flickered. The main viewing screen distorted for a second. "Report," he snapped. A technician, a younger Cathar, looked up from his station. "A minor power fluctuation in the terrestrial grid, Legate." "It is stabilizing." Vorlak nodded. It was of no concern. Human systems were always unstable. On the surface, Chul was hauling a crate of machine parts in the supply yard. The sun was bright. It was just another day. Then the lights on the Cathar Overseer's platform went out. The humming drone bots, which always floated in the air, suddenly dropped to the ground like dead insects. They hit the concrete with a series of dull clatters. The Cathar Overseer looked down at his dead control panel, his thin fingers pressing useless buttons. "What is this?" his translated voice demanded. Chul stopped moving. He looked around. All the lights in the nearby buildings were off. The constant low hum of the alien machinery had stopped. An eerie silence fell over the city. It was the silence from before the war. Then a new sound started. It was the sound of old human emergency sirens, wailing from speakers that had been silent for months. It was a sound of warning, a sound of alarm. In the orbital hub, the power fluctuation did not stabilize. "It got worse, Legate!" the technician cried out, his voice sharp with something Vorlak had never heard from a Cathar. Panic. "Gravity generation is failing." Before Vorlak could respond, the artificial gravity in the command hub reversed. It was not a failure. It was an attack. One moment, Vorlak was standing on the floor. The next, the floor became the ceiling. He was thrown upwards with terrifying force. He crashed into the metal ceiling along with his chairs, his consoles, every loose object in the room. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. He heard the sickening cracks of bones from his crew as they smashed into the hard surface above them. Then the gravity returned to normal and they all fell back down, a tangle of broken bodies and shattered equipment. Alarms blared throughout the ship. Red lights flashed. On his cracked screen, Vorlak saw reports flooding in. It was not just his ship. On the planet, a Cathar troop carrier was flying low over an ocean. Its engines were powerful, its systems secure. Then a command was sent. The life support systems read the command as a legitimate order from their own network. They shut down. The lights inside the carrier went out. The air recyclers stopped. The soldiers inside, hundreds of them, looked around in the sudden darkness. They gasped for air that would not come. They clawed at the doors that would not open. In the silent, airless dark, they slowly suffocated. The giant ship flew on, a ghost ship full of the dead, until it crashed into the waves. Another ship, parked on a landing field, had its own weapon system turned against it. The plasma cannons powered up. They swiveled around, aiming not at the sky but at the ship's own hull. They fired. The green plasma tore through the metal, igniting the fuel inside. The ship exploded in a great ball of fire, destroying 2 other ships parked beside it. It was not a battle. It was a systemic recall. The planet itself was rejecting the infection. Down in the streets, Chul saw it all happen. He saw the Cathar Overseer confused and vulnerable without his drones. He saw the fear in the alien's eyes. It was a fear Chul knew very well. It was the fear of the erased. He looked at the other workers. They were staring, confused and afraid. Chul's eyes met Hana's, the chemist. He saw the same fierce light in them that he had seen in the basement. This was not their small, desperate sabotage. This was something else. This was a chance. He pointed at the Overseer. "Now," he yelled. The spell was broken. The workers did not need weapons. They had their hands, their rage, and their numbers. They surged forward. The Cathar overseer tried to fight back, but he was overwhelmed. He disappeared under a wave of angry humanity. Chul did not join them. He ran to the overseer's platform and picked up a heavy metal bar that had fallen. He looked at the dead drone bots on the ground. Then he looked up at the sky, where the great Cathar ships were now drifting or fighting themselves. A grin, sharp and wild, spread across his face. The ghosts were fighting for them. It was time for the living to join them. To the armory, he shouted to the others. The ghosts have given us an opening. Let's not keep them waiting. The resistance, which had been a nuisance, suddenly became a coordinated force. They were not just striking randomly anymore. They moved with a new purpose, as if guided by an invisible hand. They knew which Cathar outposts were powered down. They knew which patrols were not coming back. They struck hard and fast, taking weapons, freeing prisoners, and reclaiming their city, block by block. High above, Vorlak pulled himself from the wreckage of his command center. His arm was broken. His uniform was torn. He stared at the main screen, which showed the catastrophic losses across his fleet. Ships were dead in space. Ground forces were being wiped out. It was not an enemy fleet. It was the planet. The silent, conquered planet had suddenly come alive and was killing them with their own tools. He could not understand it. The humans had no power. Their spirit was broken. This was not possible. He accessed the planetary communication channel, his voice a ragged, furious scrape. Human assets. Cease this activity. You are violating the terms of surrender. You will be deleted. There was no answer from the humans, but a new message appeared on his screen. It was not in the Cathar language. It was in the human language of the region, in simple, plain text. It was only 2 words. Reclamation in progress. In the data farm, Ji-hyun watched the chaos unfold on her screen. She saw the reports of the falling ships. She saw the resistance movements rising. She saw Chul and his people fighting back. A small cold smile touched her lips for the first time since Min-Su fell. It was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of satisfaction. The key had turned. The lock was open. The Cathar overseer in the data farm finally realized what was happening. He saw the human woman at the terminal, her fingers still moving. He drew his energy weapon and marched toward her. You, Asset, what have you done? He demanded. Ji-hyun did not look up from her screen. She simply typed one last command. The lights in the data farm went out. Then the emergency lights came on, casting long, dark shadows. The overseer stopped, confused. From the shadows between the server racks, a low electric growl sounded. The maintenance drones, the simple robots that cleaned the floors, emerged. But their programming was different now. Their small claws were extended. Their optical sensors glowed with a faint red light. The overseer backed away, raising his weapon. Stay back. The drones did not stop. They moved forward, a silent mechanical swarm. The overseer fired, but there were too many. They climbed his legs, their small claws cutting into his armor. He screamed, a raw, terrified sound as they pulled him down into the darkness. Ji-hyun stood up from her terminal. She did not look back at the sound. Her work here was done. She walked out of the data farm and into the morning light. The sky was no longer full of enemy ships. It was full of smoke and fire, and for the first time in a long time it looked like freedom. The silence that fell over Earth was different this time. It was not the silence of defeat. It was the quiet after a storm. The constant hum of the Cathar machinery was gone. The green beams of light no longer scarred the sky. Instead, smoke rose from the wrecks of alien ships and broken warwalkers. The air smelled of fire and freedom. The fight was not completely over. Isolated groups of Cathar soldiers still held out in strongholds. But they were cut off, confused, and leaderless. Their great fleet was a collection of dead metal orbiting the planet. Their command structure was shattered. The human resistance, once a desperate whisper, was now a roaring fire. Chul and his fighters, armed with captured Cathar weapons, moved through the streets like hunters. The hunted had become the hunters, but the final act of the war did not happen on the ground. It happened in the cold, dark room of the Galactic Council, far from Earth. The Council was a gathering of many different species. They had watched the Cathar conquest of Earth with quiet disapproval, but they had not interfered. The Cathar were powerful, and their methods, while harsh, were within the broad rules of war. The conquest was a fact. Earth was a lost world. Then the reports started to come in. They were chaotic and unbelievable. They spoke of the Cathar fleet being destroyed from within, They spoke of a planet that had somehow fought back and won. It was impossible. Soon, a damaged Cathar escape pod drifted into a council patrol zone. Inside was high-legged Vorlak. He was broken, both in body and spirit. His arm was in a sling. His proud uniform was torn. His eyes, once so cold and sure, were wide with a terror the council had never seen in a Cathar. He was brought before the council. The chamber was vast, with representatives of a dozen species looking down at him. High-legged Vorlak, the head counselor, a being with wise old eyes, began. "You were the conqueror of Earth. Now you are a refugee. Explain what happened." Vorlak's voice was a ragged scratch. They have a demon, a ghost in their machines. It turned our own ships against us. It suffocated my soldiers. It broke my command hub. It was not a fight. It was an erasure." The council was silent. They listened to his frantic story. He spoke of systems failing, of gravity reversing, of life support shutting down. He claimed the humans had not fought with weapons, but with the planet itself. "It was excessive," Vorlak cried out, pointing a shaking finger. "It was a violation of the rules of war. They showed no mercy. You must punish them." The council was troubled. If what Vorlak said was true, the human response was terrifying. It was one thing to fight an invader. It was another to systematically dismantle them using their own technology. It spoke of a cold, calculated ruthlessness that was unsettling. They decided they needed to hear from the humans. They sent a message to Earth asking for a representative to come and speak. They expected a grizzled warrior. They expected a fierce general covered in scars, shouting about victory and revenge. The human who arrived was a small, calm woman. She wore simple, clean clothes. Her hair was neat. Her hands were folded in front of her. She walked into the great council chamber and stood before them. Her name was Ji-hyun. The council looked at her, confused. This was the face of the planet that had destroyed the Cathar fleet? The head counselor spoke. "Ji-hyun of Earth, high-legged Vorlak has told us a remarkable story. He claims your people used a terrible and ruthless weapon to destroy his forces. He speaks of a lack of mercy. We are here to discuss the terms of this conflict and the future. We must also discuss the concept of mercy." All eyes in the room turned to Ji-hyun. She did not look at the council. Her gaze settled on Vorlak. He seemed to shrink under her calm, dark eyes. There was no hate in them. There was no anger. There was only a deep, endless cold. Her voice was soft, a quiet murmur that filled the silent chamber. "You conquered Earth?" she asked. It was a simple question. Just 3 words. The council waited for her to continue. They waited for her to list her grievances. They waited for her to describe the suffering of her people. They waited for her to demand justice or to boast of their victory. She said nothing more. She just stood there looking at Vorlak. The silence stretched out. In that silence, the council understood. They were not hearing the words of a diplomat or a soldier. They were hearing the voice of the planet itself. They saw in her eyes the memory of cities turned to dust. They saw the image of a husband falling to the ground. They saw the tears of a child taken from her mother. They saw that this woman was not asking a question. She was stating a fact that for her contained its own judgment and its own sentence. Vorlak had conquered Earth, and Earth had responded. There was nothing more to discuss. The concept of mercy is a luxury. It is an idea that belongs to those who have the power to choose. It is a human idea. But the Cathar, with their logic and their deletions, had taught humanity a new way. They had taught them that mercy could be a weakness. They had taught them that to show mercy to those who have none is to be conquered again. Ji-hyun's silence, her calm, and her simple question were the final proof. The humans had learned the lesson well. They had learned it with the blood of their loved ones and the ashes of their cities. The council looked from the broken, begging Vorlak to the utterly composed Ji-hyun. They saw the before and the after. They saw the conqueror and the conquered, and they realized the roles had been reversed in the most absolute way. They finally understood. Mercy was no longer a human concept. The head counselor slowly nodded. He did not speak to Ji-hyun again. He turned to his guards. "Take high-legged Vorlak into custody," he said, his voice heavy. "The case of the Cathar Concordance versus Earth is concluded." Ji-hyun gave a small, polite bow. Then she turned and walked out of the chamber, her steps quiet and sure. She did not look back. The war was over. Her work was done. Somewhere on Earth, a little girl was waiting for her mother to come home.